Margaret Coleman had exactly $400 in her checking account and a car full of everything she still owned when she pulled into the town of Millbrook on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of gray afternoon that made even bright places look tired. She was 43 years old. 2 months earlier, she had been Margaret Hale, wife of Richard Hale, owner of a house with a finished basement and a garden she had spent 12 years building. Now she was Margaret Coleman again, her maiden name, because taking it back had felt like the only thing in the divorce she actually got to choose. Richard had kept the house. He had kept most of the furniture, since technically it was purchased with money from his salary, and the lawyer, a tired woman named Diane, who Margaret suspected had seen 1,000 divorces just like hers, had told her not to fight over end tables when there were bigger things to fight for. There hadn't turned out to be bigger things. Richard's business had structured itself in ways that made most of it untouchable, and Margaret had walked away with a settlement that covered exactly 1 year of modest living, if she was careful. She had not been planning to come to Millbrook. She had been planning to stay in Denver, closer to her sister, closer to something familiar. But 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, a letter had arrived from a law office in Millbrook, a town she had visited exactly once, for a funeral, 11 years earlier. The letter was about Aunt Ruth. Ruth Coleman was not actually Margaret's aunt by blood. She was Richard's aunt, his father's younger sister, a woman who had run a bakery in Millbrook for nearly 40 years before arthritis and stubbornness finally lost their long argument with each other. Margaret had met her exactly twice, once at her own wedding and once at that funeral for Richard's father, and both times she had liked her more than she expected to, the way you sometimes like people who say exactly what they think and don't apologize for it. Ruth had died in August, alone, in the apartment above the bakery, at 78 years old. And in her will, which the lawyer's letter explained with the flat patience of someone delivering unexpected news, she had left the bakery building not to Richard, not to any of her other nieces and nephews, but to Margaret. There was no explanation in the letter, just an address, a date for reading of the will, and a phone number. Margaret had almost thrown the letter away. She had almost called the lawyer and said, "Sell it, send me whatever it's worth, I don't need a broken-down bakery in a town I don't live in." But something had stopped her, some small, stubborn thing that had survived the divorce mostly intact, and instead, she had gotten in her car 3 weeks later with everything she owned and driven 6 hours to find out what Ruth Coleman had actually left her. The bakery sat on the corner of Main Street and Chestnut, a squat brick building with a faded sign that still said Coleman's in gold letters that had mostly flaked away. The windows were dark. A padlock hung on the front door, newer than everything else about the building, put there by the lawyer's office to keep it secure until the estate was settled. Margaret parked across the street and sat in her car for a long time, just looking at it. It was smaller than she remembered. Everything about the town felt smaller than she remembered, the kind of place where you could walk from one end of the business district to the other in 10 minutes and still have time to spare. There was a hardware store, a diner, a small grocery, a church with a white steeple that looked like it had been photographed for a postcard at some point in the last century, and never needed to be photographed again. The bakery sat almost exactly in the middle of it all, prime real estate by Millbrook standards, which Margaret would later understand, mattered a great deal more than she realized that first afternoon. She met the lawyer, a heavy-set man named Walter Briggs, at his office the next morning. He handed her the keys, a thin folder of paperwork, and a look that she couldn't quite read. "You know this building's had some trouble," he said. Not quite a question. "I don't know anything about it," Margaret admitted. "I barely knew Ruth." Briggs studied her for a moment. He had the careful, measuring quality of a small-town lawyer who had spent decades learning which conversations were worth having and which weren't. "3 people have tried to make a go of that bakery since Ruth got too sick to run it herself. She leased it out twice in her last 5 years, once to a young couple from Denver, once to a fellow from 2 towns over. Both of them went under within a year. Building's been sitting empty for almost 2 years now." "Why did it fail? Twice?" Briggs was quiet for a moment. Bad luck, some people say. Bad location, other people say, though I never understood that argument myself. That corner's the best foot traffic in town. Ruth always said the building was cursed, but Ruth said a lot of things, and she said most of them with a smile that made you not sure if she meant them. What do you think? Margaret asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. I think this town has one man in it who decides a great deal more than he should, and I think both times that bakery started doing well enough to be worth noticing, something happened that made it stop doing well. I could be wrong. I'm an old man who's been in this town too long and sees patterns that might not be there. He slid a business card across the desk. That said, if you're planning to actually try this, you might want to talk to a woman named Patricia Voss before you make any decisions. She ran the diner 2 doors down for 30 years. She knows this town better than anyone alive, including me. Margaret took the card. She did not yet know that Walter Briggs had just handed her the first thread of something that would take her the better part of a year to fully unravel. The bakery itself, once she got the padlock off and stepped inside, told its own story before anyone spoke a word. Dust lay thick over everything, undisturbed for 2 years. But underneath the dust, Margaret could see the bones of something that had once been loved. The counters were real marble, worn smooth in the places where thousands of hands had rested while waiting for change. The old brick oven in the back, cold now, was the kind of oven that professional bakers paid enormous amounts of money to install new. And this one looked original to the building, maybe 100 years old, built to last centuries if anyone bothered to keep using it. Shelves lined one wall, empty now except for a scattering of old tins and a few cookbooks so worn their spines had cracked. She walked through slowly, running her hand along the marble counter, feeling something she couldn't name yet. Not quite grief, since she had barely known Ruth. Not quite excitement, since she had no idea what she was looking at or what it would cost to fix. Something else. Something that felt almost like recognition. The way you feel when you walk into a room and some part of you that you didn't know was tired finally sets something down. In the back office, a cramped room behind the kitchen that had clearly served as Ruth's private space, Margaret found a filing cabinet, mostly business records that meant nothing to her yet, and a small wooden box sitting on the desk, dust-free, as if someone had wiped it recently, though that made no sense since the building had been locked for 2 years. Inside the box was a stack of index cards, recipes written in careful cursive, and a smaller sealed envelope with Margaret's name on it. Her hands were not quite steady when she opened it. The letter inside was short. Ruth had clearly written it near the end, the handwriting looser than the recipe cards, but the voice in it was unmistakably hers, direct and unsentimental in a way Margaret remembered from their 2 brief meetings. Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the lawyers did their job. I know you barely knew me, and you're probably wondering why I left you this place instead of my actual nieces and nephews, who have been circling this building like vultures since I got sick. Here's the truth. I watched you at Richard's father's funeral 11 years ago. You spent the whole reception in the kitchen helping the caterers instead of standing around with the family making small talk you didn't care about. You did it without being asked and without making a show of it. I decided that day that you were the only person in this family who understood that work is love and love is work, and everything else is just talk. I don't know what your life looks like now. I don't know if you'll want this place or sell it the day the paperwork clears. But if some part of you is looking for a reason to build something again, this building has good bones and a good corner, and 40 years of my life in every brick. There is a man in this town named Daniel Whitfield who has wanted this corner for longer than I have owned it. He will come for you the way he came for the others. Be smarter than they were. And check under the 3rd shelf in the back storage room, behind the loose board. Whatever you decide, that part is yours outright, no questions asked. Ruth. Margaret read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to move. Then she went to the storage room, found the 3rd shelf, and behind a board that came loose with surprisingly little effort, found a metal box holding $11,000 in cash and a second, shorter note that simply said, "Don't let anyone make you small." She sat down on the dusty floor of the storage room and cried for the first time since the divorce had been finalized. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, disorienting weight of being trusted by someone who had barely known her, more than she had felt trusted by anyone in the last 2 years of her marriage. Patricia Voss turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s who ran the diner with the same unhurried competence Margaret imagined she'd once run it for 30 years, even though she had technically retired and handed the diner to her daughter 5 years earlier. She still showed up every morning at 6 to help with the breakfast rush, because, as she told Margaret over coffee on her second morning in town, retirement is a story people tell themselves. I like being useful. When Margaret explained who she was and mentioned Ruth's bakery, something shifted in Patricia's face, a kind of alertness that hadn't been there a moment before. "You're the niece," Patricia said. "The one from Denver. I was married to Ruth's nephew. We're divorced now." "Doesn't matter. Ruth talked about you." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "She said if the bakery ever went to you, you'd either run the other direction fast, or you'd be the one who finally made Daniel Whitfield sorry he ever looked twice at that corner." "Who is Daniel Whitfield?" Patricia's mouth tightened. "Owns about a third of the storefronts on Main Street, plus the strip mall out by the highway, plus he's on the town planning committee, plus his brother-in-law runs the only bank in town that does small business loans. If you want to open a business in Millbrook and Daniel Whitfield doesn't like it, you will have a very hard time getting it insured, financed, or supplied. If you want to open a business and Daniel Whitfield does like it, doors open that you didn't know existed. And he wants the bakery. He's wanted that corner for 15 years. There's talk, has been for a while, about a bypass road going in that would connect the highway straight through downtown. And if that happens, that corner becomes the single most valuable piece of property in this town." Ruth always suspected he knew something concrete about it, something not public yet. She refused to sell on principle. Then she got sick and couldn't run the place herself anymore, and she leased it out instead of selling, mostly, I think, just to keep him from getting it. What happened to the people she leased it to? Patricia was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee though it clearly didn't need it. "The first couple, sweet kids, they had a great little operation going for about 8 months. Good bread, good coffee, people started coming from 2 towns over. Then their flour supplier suddenly couldn't fill their orders anymore. No explanation given. And the only other supplier within 100 miles happened to also supply Whitfield's own coffee shop out at the highway plaza, and that supplier decided the young couple's account was too small to bother with. They tried to source flour themselves, driving hours each way, and it wore them down financially and otherwise until they broke the lease and left." "And the second one?" "Fellow named Curtis. Different approach. He tried to get a small business loan to expand into catering, got denied by the only bank in town for reasons that were technically legitimate, but felt awfully convenient. Then his insurance got flagged for some inspection issue that took months to resolve, and by the time it resolved, he'd lost too much money to keep going." Patricia looked at Margaret steadily. "I'm not saying any of that proves anything in a court of law. I'm saying it happened to both of them, in slightly different ways. And both times, right before it happened, Daniel Whitfield made an offer on the building that Ruth turned down." Margaret sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into her chest alongside everything else she was already carrying. "Why are you telling me this?" Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Because Ruth was my friend for 30 years, and I watched what it cost her to hold on to that building instead of just taking the easy money and letting the whole thing go. And because you've got a look about you that reminds me a little of her. Like you're deciding something right now, sitting in my diner, and you haven't told yourself the answer yet. But I already know what it's going to be." Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out the diner window at the bakery across the street, at the faded gold letters, at the dark windows that had been dark for 2 years, waiting for someone to decide they were worth the trouble. She thought about Richard's house, the one she'd spent 12 years making beautiful, and how none of it had actually belonged to her when it mattered. She thought about the divorce lawyer telling her not to fight over end tables. She thought about $11,000 in a metal box and a note that said, "Don't let anyone make you small." "I'm going to need a contractor," she said finally. "And I'm going to need to understand exactly what's wrong with that oven before I spend $1 on anything else." Patricia smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. A small, satisfied smile that Margaret would come to recognize over the following months as the particular expression Patricia wore whenever she'd been right about something. "There's a man named Frank Delgado does contracting work around here. Good and honest. Doesn't do business with Whitfield if he can help it after a dispute they had years back over a job Whitfield tried to stiff him on. I'll give you his number." And that oven. Ruth had a mason friend maintain it every couple years. Old brick ovens like that just need someone who actually understands them, which is rarer than you'd think. Margaret spent that first week going through Ruth's records, learning the shape of the business that had existed before it stopped existing, and getting a slowly forming picture of a woman who had built something real out of stubbornness and skill and had refused, right up until her body simply couldn't do it anymore, to let anyone push her out of it. Frank Delgado came by on a Thursday, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with flour dust still visible in the creases of his hands from some other job, and walked through the building with the same slow, evaluating attention Margaret was starting to recognize as the way people in this town looked at things that mattered. "Oven's solid," he said, after spending nearly 20 minutes just examining the brickwork. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing, and Ruth kept it maintained. You'll need the flue cleaned and inspected, and there's some mortar work needed around the base, but structurally, this thing will outlive both of us." He looked around at the rest of the space. Rest of it's cosmetic mostly. Counters need refinishing, not replacing. Wiring's old but not dangerous, though you'll want it updated before you get an inspector in here for a business license. Roof's the real question. I'd want to get up there and look before I tell you anything for certain. What's the honest estimate, if I wanted to actually reopen this place? Frank considered the question carefully, the way Margaret was learning everyone in Millbrook considered questions before answering them. 15 to 20,000 to do it right, assuming the roof doesn't surprise us. Could be less if you're willing to do some of the cosmetic work yourself. Could be more if that flue's worse than it looks from down here. Margaret did the math in her head. 11,000 from the metal box, plus whatever remained of her $400 in settlement money after basic living expenses, minus whatever this town's cost of living turned out to actually be. It was tight. It was more than tight. It was the kind of number that should have made her walk away and sell the building to whoever wanted it, take the money, and start over somewhere safer. Instead, she found herself asking, "When can you start?" Frank studied her for a moment, something like respect moving across his weathered face. "Ruth would have liked that answer," he said. "I can start Monday. Fair warning though, Miss Coleman. Whitfield's going to hear you're doing this within about a day, maybe less. Small town. And once he hears it, I'd expect he's going to come around and make you an offer, friendly as anything, like he's doing you a favor. What do I do when he does?" Frank picked up his tools, moving toward the door. "Whatever you do with any offer that comes from someone who's already tried twice to make sure you'd fail before you even started." He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. Ruth used to say the man mistook two things for the same thing: patience and permission. He was patient about this corner for 15 years because he assumed eventually someone would give him permission, one way or another, to take it. She never gave it to him. Question is whether you're the kind of person who does. He was right about the timing. Daniel Whitfield came by on Saturday morning, 3 days after Frank's visit, while Margaret was on a ladder in the front window, trying to get a better look at the sign that needed either repair or replacement. She heard the bell over the door and turned to find a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive but understated jacket standing just inside the entrance, looking around the space with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked into 1,000 rooms in his life and expected all of them to eventually go his way. "You must be Margaret," he said. Before she'd said a word, his voice warm in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Daniel Whitfield. I knew Ruth for many years. I was very sorry to hear about her passing. Margaret climbed down from the ladder, wiping her hands on her jeans, taking her time about it. Mr. Whitfield, I've heard your name. Something flickered across his face, gone almost before she registered it. All good things, I hope. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. She kept her voice even, pleasant even, the tone she'd learned to use in 12 years of corporate wife dinners, where saying exactly what you thought was rarely the wise choice. She was surprised to find the skill transferred well to this situation too. Whitfield's smile held, though something behind it recalibrated slightly, the way people's expressions did when they realized a conversation wasn't going to unfold quite as smoothly as they'd expected. I wanted to come by personally and welcome you to Millbrook, and to let you know that if you're thinking about what to do with this building, I'd be glad to make you a fair offer. Save you the trouble and expense of trying to bring an old place like this back to life. These old buildings can be money pits. I'm sure Frank Delgado already told you that. He told me it had good bones. Good bones and a functioning business are two very different things, Whitfield said, his tone still pleasant, still warm, but with something underneath it now that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of every man who had ever explained something to her that she already understood better than he did. This corner has had trouble sustaining a business for years now. I'd hate to see you invest your savings, and I understand you're recently divorced, so I imagine those savings matter a great deal, into something that's struggled twice before, under more experienced hands than yours. There it was. The soft threat, wrapped in concern, the reminder that he knew things about her circumstances, the implication that her inexperience made failure inevitable. Margaret felt something in her chest go very still and very clear, the same feeling she imagined Ruth must have felt standing in this exact spot, being told the same things in slightly different words. "What's your offer?" she asked. Whitfield's expression brightened slightly, clearly reading the question as an opening. "I'd need to have it properly appraised, but I could start the conversation at $70,000. That's well above market for a building in this condition, and it would let you walk away clean, no renovation costs, no risk." $70,000 was more money than Margaret had seen in one place since the divorce settlement. It would solve every immediate problem she had. It would let her go back to Denver, or anywhere, and start fresh without the terrifying uncertainty of trying to rebuild a failed bakery in a town she'd lived in for exactly 1 week. She thought about Ruth's letter. "Don't let anyone make you small." "I appreciate you coming by, Mr. Whitfield," she said, "but I'm not selling." The warmth in his face cooled by several careful degrees, though his voice stayed just as pleasant. "That's certainly your right. I just hate to see you struggle the way the previous tenants did. This corner has a way of testing people who aren't quite ready for it." "I'll keep that in mind," Margaret said. "Was there anything else?" He looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret understood, with the same cold clarity Clara Whitmore must have felt, facing down Silas Garrett in a story she would never read, but somehow already understood in her bones, that she had just watched a man revise his assessment of how easy this was going to be. "No," he said finally. "That's all for today." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with something that might have been the first genuinely unguarded expression he'd shown since walking in. "You remind me of her, you know. Ruth. She said no to me in almost those exact words, first time I made her an offer, 20 years ago." "I'll take that as a compliment," Margaret said. "It wasn't necessarily meant as one," Whitfield replied, and walked out, the bell over the door ringing sharply behind him. Margaret stood alone in the empty bakery for a long moment after he left, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, her hands not quite steady. Then she looked around at the dusty counters, the cold oven, the faded gold letters visible through the window from the inside, backward now, spelling out a name that had survived 40 years and one very determined man's patience. She picked up her phone and called Frank Delgado. Monday still works, she said when he answered. I want to get started as soon as possible. Whitfield came by, didn't he? Frank said. It wasn't really a question. He offered me $70,000 to walk away. There was a pause on the line, and when Frank spoke again, there was something in his voice that sounded almost like satisfaction. And what did you tell him? I told him no. Good, Frank said. Then I'll see you Monday morning. Bring coffee. Long few months ahead of us. Margaret hung up the phone and looked around the empty bakery one more time, at the marble counters worn smooth by decades of hands, at the old brick oven waiting to be lit again, at the recipe cards sitting in their small wooden box in the back office, written in careful cursive by a woman who had spent 40 years refusing to be moved. All right, Ruth, she said quietly, to the empty room, to no one, to the woman who had trusted her with all of this without ever really knowing her. Let's see what we can build. Outside, the gray afternoon was starting to clear, thin autumn sunlight breaking through the clouds and falling across Main Street, across the diner where Patricia Voss was probably already telling someone the news, across the hardware store where Frank Delgado would soon be gathering supplies, across the strip mall on the highway where Daniel Whitfield was, at this exact moment, almost certainly making a phone call to someone, setting the next piece of whatever game he'd been playing in this town for 15 years into motion. Margaret didn't know yet exactly what that next move would be, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was going to be ready for it when it came. She turned off the lights, locked the door behind her, and walked back toward the small rented room above the hardware store that was, for now, the only home she had, already making a list in her head of everything that needed to happen before Monday morning. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the first real frost of the season silvering the grass along Main Street, and Margaret was standing outside the bakery at 6:30 with 2 cups of coffee from Patricia's diner when Frank Delgado's truck pulled up, followed a few minutes later by a second truck she didn't recognize, driven by a lean young man who introduced himself as Frank's nephew Miguel, an electrician who'd apparently agreed to help with the wiring as a favor. Word travels fast in this family, Margaret said, handing over the coffee. Word travels fast in this whole town, Frank said. Might as well get used to that now. They started with the oven flue, since everything else depended on knowing whether the heart of the building actually worked. Frank spent the better part of the morning up on the roof with a flashlight and a long brush, calling down measurements and observations that meant little to Margaret, but seemed to please him more with each passing hour. By noon he climbed down, wiping soot from his hands with a rag, and delivered his verdict with the same careful economy he seemed to apply to everything. Flue's clean enough once we clear the last of the old buildup. No cracks, no structural damage. Whoever kept this thing maintained knew exactly what they were doing. He looked at Margaret. You got lucky. This part alone would have cost you $15,000 if it needed real work. It doesn't. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight since Whitfield's visit. It was the first genuinely good news since she'd arrived in Millbrook, and she found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. The next month became a rhythm she hadn't expected to find so quickly. Mornings started early, coffee at Patricia's, then hours of work at the bakery, sanding counters, stripping old paint, watching Miguel run new wiring with the patient concentration of someone who genuinely loved his work. Margaret learned to use a sander properly, learned the particular ache in her shoulders that came from hours of manual labor, learned that her hands, which had spent 12 years manicured and mostly decorative, could actually be useful for something. She also learned, slowly and through small conversations dropped here and there by Frank and Miguel and Patricia, more about the shape of Daniel Whitfield's influence over the town. He owns the building the hardware store rents from, Frank mentioned one afternoon while they were working on the front counter. Owns the strip mall out on the highway. Owns about half the storefronts downtown outright, and the ones he doesn't own, he's usually got some kind of financial hook into somehow, a loan he co-signed, a lease he holds paper on. How does one man get that much control over a town this size? Frank was quiet for a moment, sanding a stubborn patch of old varnish. His family's been here 4 generations. His grandfather ran the bank, back when Millbrook actually had more than one. His father ran the biggest farm operation in the county before he sold most of it off and diversified into real estate. Daniel just kept building on what he inherited. Man's smart, I'll give him that. He doesn't do anything you could easily prove was wrong. He just makes sure the town keeps needing him, one piece at a time, until nobody feels like they can afford to say no to him about anything. Ruth said no to him. Ruth, Frank said, with something like reverence in his voice, was the one person in this town who never needed anything from him. She owned her building outright, had for 40 years, paid off the mortgage before I was even born. She didn't bank with his brother-in-law, kept her savings somewhere out of town, some credit union 2 counties over. She didn't need his suppliers because she'd built relationships with farmers directly, people who'd been selling her flour and eggs and butter since before Whitfield's father sold off the farm. She built herself a life where he simply had no leverage over her, and that made him crazy, because it meant the only tool he had left was trying to break her financially through other channels, and even that never quite worked. Margaret sat with that for a long moment, understanding settling into her slowly. That's why the other tenants failed. They didn't have that same independence. Exactly right. The young couple, sweet as they were, they leased their equipment through a company that turned out to have ties to Whitfield's cousin. Curtis banked locally because it was convenient. Neither of them built the kind of insulation Ruth had spent 40 years constructing. Frank looked at her directly. You're going to need to build that same insulation, and fast, before he finds whatever weak point you've got. That conversation sent Margaret into her first genuinely strategic planning since arriving in town. She spent an evening with Ruth's old business records spread across the desk in the back office, tracing the supplier relationships Ruth had maintained, most of which, remarkably, still existed. A dairy farm 20 minutes outside town, run by a family named Kowalski, who had supplied Ruth with butter and cream for over 2 decades. A grain mill in the next county that Ruth had used for her flour. A relationship that had apparently survived even the 2 years the bakery had been closed, since the mill owner, a woman named Doreen, had sent a sympathy card when Ruth died, and mentioned in it that she'd kept Ruth's standing order details on file, just in case. Margaret called Doreen the next morning. I wondered if someone would eventually call about that account, Doreen said, once Margaret explained who she was. Ruth talked about you, you know. Said if anyone ever took over that bakery, it'd probably be some niece from the city who didn't know a thing about baking. That's roughly accurate, Margaret admitted. Doreen laughed, a warm, easy sound. Well, I can't teach you to bake, but I can make sure you've got flour whenever you need it. Same terms Ruth always had. And I'll tell you something else, since you seem like you might need to hear it. Ruth called me about 8 months before she died. Said if anything ever happened to her and someone new took over the bakery, I should watch for anyone trying to interfere with the account, mess with pricing, delay deliveries, anything unusual. Told me it might be Daniel Whitfield trying to squeeze whoever came next, the same way he squeezed the ones before you. Margaret felt a chill move through her, equal parts unsettling and strangely comforting. Ruth had been thinking about this, planning for this, even from a hospital bed, months before Margaret had any idea the bakery existed. Did anything ever happen? With the account? Not yet, Doreen said. But now that I know it's actually happening, that someone's actually taking over, I'll keep an extra careful eye on things. You call me the moment anything feels off, you hear? Ruth was good people, and I don't forget who's good to me. By the end of the second week, Margaret had rebuilt 3 of Ruth's original supplier relationships, opened a business account at the same out-of-town credit union Ruth had used, and started, slowly, to understand the shape of the insulation Frank had told her she needed to build. It felt less like starting a business and more like reconstructing a fortress, brick by careful brick, using a blueprint left behind by a woman who had understood exactly what kind of siege was coming. The bakery itself was starting to look like a bakery again. The counters gleamed under fresh polish. The old cracked tile floor had been repaired rather than replaced, since Frank insisted the original tile was better quality than anything available now, and the front window, Once Margaret had it professionally cleaned, let in a flood of afternoon light that made the whole space feel warm and alive in a way it hadn't when she'd first walked in. The sign was the last major piece. Margaret had debated replacing it entirely, but something about the faded gold letters, worn but not gone, felt important to preserve. She found a sign painter 2 towns over, an older man named Elias, who specialized in restoring rather than replacing old storefront lettering, and watched over 3 days as he carefully brought Coleman's back to something close to its original glory, the gold catching afternoon light in a way that made Margaret's chest tighten every time she looked at it. She was standing outside admiring the finished sign on a Thursday afternoon in November when a woman approached her, someone Margaret hadn't met yet, though the woman clearly knew who she was. "You're Ruth's Margaret," the woman said. She was perhaps 60, sturdy and weathered in the way of someone who worked outdoors, with sharp blue eyes that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of Whitfield's assessing gaze, though the warmth behind them was entirely different. "I suppose I am," Margaret said. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Helen Kowalski. My family's been supplying Ruth's dairy for going on 25 years. Helen looked up at the freshly restored sign, something soft moving across her weathered face. "Never thought I'd see that sign lit up again. My daughters used to work here summers, back when they were teenagers. Best job either of them ever had," Ruth used to say. "I've been meaning to call your farm," Margaret said. "Doreen at the mill mentioned you supply butter and cream." "Doreen already called me," Helen said with a small smile. "Small town, remember. I hear you're getting the wiring done by Frank's nephew, floors done right instead of just papered over, and you told Daniel Whitfield no to his face when he offered you $70,000. She studied Margaret with open curiosity. "That true?" "That part's true, yes." Helen nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already decided to believe. "Then you'll have my family's business, same terms as Ruth always got, and I'll tell you something for free, since you clearly need every advantage you can get in this fight." She glanced up and down the street before continuing, her voice dropping slightly. "There's a bypass proposal coming up for a vote at the town council meeting next month. Been quietly worked on for over a year, mostly behind closed doors. If it passes, this corner where your bakery sits becomes the main entry point into downtown from the new highway connector. Property values on this block are going to triple, maybe more." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Whitfield's on the planning committee." "Whitfield chairs the planning committee," Helen corrected. "And he's been buying up options on properties along the proposed route for the better part of a year, quiet as he can manage it. Your bakery's the one piece of that puzzle he doesn't already control, and word is he's getting anxious about it, especially now that Ruth's gone, and there was a chance he thought the building might finally come available. Instead, it came to me." "Instead it came to you," Helen agreed, "which I imagine is making him a great deal more anxious than he was letting on that day he offered you $70,000. She looked at Margaret directly, something serious and careful in her expression. "You should know the vote's coming up, and you should know that if this bypass passes and someone finds a way to force you out before it does, whoever ends up owning this corner stands to make an enormous amount of money very quickly. That's not a small thing to be standing in the way of, Margaret. I want you to understand exactly what you're up against." Margaret looked at the freshly painted sign above her, at the gold letters catching the November light, at the corner that Ruth Coleman had refused to give up for 15 years, even as 3 separate people tried to force her out of it in 3 different ways. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me." Helen nodded once, satisfied. "Ruth would have wanted you to know. She always said the worst thing you could do in a fight like this was walk into it blind." She turned to leave, then paused, looking back. "Grand opening. When's it happening?" Margaret hadn't actually set a date yet, had been so consumed with the physical work of restoration that the actual reopening had remained a distant, almost theoretical future point. But standing there under the newly restored sign, With Helen Kowalski's warning still settling into her chest, she found herself answering with more certainty than she felt. 2 weeks from Saturday, she said. I'll be there, Helen said, and I'll bring people. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest and fastest of Margaret's time in Millbrook. Frank finished the last of the structural work. Miguel completed the wiring and helped install new lighting that made the whole space glow warm and golden in the evenings. And Margaret herself spent long hours in the kitchen, testing Ruth's recipes one by one, filling the bakery with the smell of fresh bread for the first time in 2 years. The first loaf she pulled from the restored oven, a simple sourdough made from a recipe card in Ruth's careful cursive, came out slightly uneven, one side darker than the other. The crust cracked in a place it probably shouldn't have cracked. Margaret stood in the kitchen holding it, tears she hadn't expected suddenly blurring her vision, overwhelmed by the simple physical reality of having actually made something with her own hands in an oven that had sat cold and silent for 2 years, using instructions left behind by a woman who had believed, for reasons Margaret still didn't fully understand, that she was capable of this. She ate a slice standing at the marble counter, the crust still warm, and it was, without question, the best thing she had eaten in years. Word of the reopening spread through Millbrook with the particular speed Margaret was learning to expect from small towns, faster than any advertising she could have paid for. Patricia mentioned it to every customer who came through the diner. Helen Kowalski, true to her word, told everyone she knew, which turned out to be nearly everyone in the surrounding farm community. Doreen at the mill mentioned it to her own customer base 2 counties over. By the Wednesday before the opening, Margaret had fielded calls from a local newspaper wanting to do a small feature, and had been asked by no fewer than 6 people whether the bakery would be doing custom orders for the upcoming holidays. Daniel Whitfield, notably, did not call. Margaret noticed his silence more than she expected to, a kind of held breath quality to the week, as if the whole town understood that something was coming, even though nothing visible had happened yet. Frank noticed it too. He's watching, Frank said, on the Thursday before opening, as they did a final walkthrough of the space together. Man like that doesn't just give up because you said no once. He's figuring out his next move. And my guess is he's waiting to see how well the opening actually goes before he decides what that move needs to be. What do you think it'll be? Frank considered the question with his usual careful patience. Could be anything. Health inspectors suddenly finding problems that weren't there before. Insurance companies suddenly deciding your policy needs review. Some regulation nobody's enforced in years suddenly getting enforced against you specifically. He looked at her steadily. I'd keep every piece of paper you generate from here forward. Every inspection, every permit, every receipt. If he comes at you through official channels, you want a paper trail so clean nobody can argue with it. Margaret took the advice seriously, starting a meticulous filing system that first week, something she'd never bothered with in her old life, where Richard had handled all the household paperwork, and she'd simply signed whatever he put in front of her. There was something satisfying about building this new habit, this new competence, brick by careful brick, alongside the physical restoration of the bakery itself. The grand opening arrived on a cold, bright Saturday morning in late November, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the whole town look freshly painted. Margaret had been awake since 4, the ovens already filled with the day's first batch, the smell of bread and cinnamon rolls drifting out onto Main Street even before she'd unlocked the front door. She hadn't expected the crowd. By 7, when she finally turned the sign to open, there were already a dozen people waiting outside, mostly locals she recognized from her weeks in town. Frank and his wife, Miguel, Patricia, Helen Kowalski, with 2 of her daughters, Walter Briggs the lawyer, looking faintly surprised to find himself there. By 8, the line stretched nearly to the corner, and Margaret found herself working the counter alongside a teenage girl named Casey she'd hired the week before, both of them moving as fast as they could to keep up with an order flow that felt, to Margaret's still disbelieving mind, like something out of a dream she hadn't quite believed she was allowed to have. Patricia stopped by the counter around mid-morning, during a brief lull, holding a cup of coffee and looking at the crowded bakery with open satisfaction. Ruth would be so pleased with this, she said. So pleased, and probably furious that it took 2 years and a divorce to bring the right person along to do it. I keep expecting something to go wrong, Margaret admitted, wiping flour from her hands. It feels too easy. It hasn't been easy, Patricia pointed out. You've worked yourself half to death these past 6 weeks. This is just the first morning it's paying off. Enjoy it, Margaret. Whatever comes next, you earned this morning fair and square. Margaret was still holding on to that thought, still trying to let herself simply enjoy the warmth of the crowded bakery, and the smell of fresh bread, and the particular satisfaction of watching strangers close their eyes in pleasure at the first bite of something she'd made with her own hands, when the bell over the door rang again and Daniel Whitfield walked in. The bakery went quiet in the particular way rooms sometimes go quiet, when someone enters who carries weight the room can feel before it fully understands why. Whitfield moved through the space slowly, taking in the crowd, the restored counters, the golden light, the line still stretching toward the door, with an expression that gave away nothing except perhaps a very slight, very controlled tightening around his eyes. "Margaret," he said, when he finally reached the counter, his voice as warm and pleasant as it had been the first time they'd met, though Margaret was learning to hear the calculation underneath it now. "Quite a crowd you've got here. Congratulations." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said, keeping her own voice equally pleasant, equally controlled. "Can I get you something? The cinnamon rolls have been the most popular item so far." Something flickered across his face, gone almost instantly, and Margaret understood that he hadn't expected the offer, hadn't expected her to simply treat him as a customer rather than an adversary, hadn't expected the crowded room to make his usual approach of quiet, private pressure quite so difficult to deploy. "I'll take one," he said finally. "And a coffee, if you have it." She served him herself, handing over the roll and the coffee with the same efficient friendliness she'd been offering every other customer that morning, and watched him take a bite, watched something almost involuntary move across his expression at the taste of it, a flicker of genuine surprise quickly smoothed back into practiced neutrality. "Your aunt's recipe," Margaret said, unable to resist the small satisfaction of watching him realize exactly what he was tasting. "I recognize it," Whitfield said quietly. He set the roll down on the small plate she'd given him, looking at it for a long moment before looking back up at her. "You've done impressive work in a short amount of time. I underestimated how quickly you'd move. I had good instructions to follow." "Yes," he said. "I imagine you did." He looked around the crowded bakery one more time, at Frank and Miguel sitting together near the window, at Helen Kowalski's daughters helping Casey bus tables without even being asked, at the whole warm, bustling scene that had assembled itself, seemingly overnight, around this one stubborn corner of Main Street he had wanted for 15 years. "I'll be seeing you around, Margaret," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, something quiet and careful, and entirely without the warmth he'd been performing since he walked in, that told her this was not a farewell but a promise. He left without finishing the roll, the bell ringing sharply behind him, and Margaret stood at the counter for a moment, watching through the window as he walked back up Main Street toward his car, his phone already at his ear before he'd even reached the sidewalk's end. Patricia appeared at her elbow, having watched the entire exchange from across the room. "Well," she said, "that's the first move made. Question now is what the second one looks like." Margaret didn't have to wait long to find out. The health inspector arrived 4 days later, on a Wednesday morning, unannounced, a thin, nervous-looking man named Perkins, who Margaret would later learn was new to the county, having only started the job 3 months earlier, and who seemed uncomfortable from the moment he walked through the door. "Routine inspection," he said, though something in his tone made the word routine feel anything but. He moved through the kitchen with a clipboard, checking things Margaret had already checked and rechecked herself with the same meticulous care Frank had advised: temperature logs, storage procedures, the newly updated wiring Miguel had installed to code, the properly maintained flue Frank had personally certified. He found nothing wrong. Margaret watched his face as he worked through the checklist, watched something like relief and something like disappointment move across it in equal measure, and understood, with the same cold clarity she'd felt the day Whitfield offered her $70,000, that this inspection had not been routine at all, and that Perkins himself seemed to understand that better than he wanted to admit. "Everything looks in order," he said finally, signing off on the inspection sheet with visible relief. "Genuinely well-maintained operation you've got here, Miss Coleman." "Thank you," Margaret said. "Can I ask what prompted the visit? I thought new businesses usually got their first inspection scheduled a few weeks after opening, not 4 days in." Perkins hesitated, something uncomfortable crossing his young face. "There was a complaint," he admitted finally. "Anonymous. Said there might be some code violations with the oven installation, given the age of the building." "And was there?" "No," he said. "Whoever called it in was wrong, or—" He trailed off, not quite willing to finish the thought out loud, but Margaret understood exactly what he wasn't saying, and something in his hesitant, uncomfortable expression told her he understood it too, understood exactly whose name probably belonged behind that anonymous complaint, and didn't love the position it had put him in. "Thank you for being thorough," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady, professional, giving him no reason to feel more uncomfortable than he already did. "I appreciate you doing your job carefully." After he left, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the cool marble counter, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way she'd learned to do in the last stressful months of her marriage, when Richard's voice would rise and she'd needed a moment to find her footing again before responding. This was, she understood clearly, only the beginning. She thought about Frank's warning, about the paper trail she'd already started building, about the supplier relationships she'd rebuilt with Doreen and Helen specifically to insulate herself from exactly this kind of pressure. She thought about Ruth's letter, about, "Don't let anyone make you small," and she thought, with a growing sense of clarity that felt almost like relief, that whatever Daniel Whitfield thought he knew about how to break someone who tried to hold this corner against him, he had badly underestimated how much preparation had already been done before he even started. She reached for her phone and called Walter Briggs. "I think I need a lawyer who specializes in something other than estate law," she said, when he picked up. "Someone who understands zoning, business regulation, that kind of thing. Someone who isn't connected to Daniel Whitfield in any way I need to worry about." There was a pause on the line, and when Briggs spoke again, there was something approving in his voice. "I know exactly the person," he said. "Woman named Sarah Chen, works out of the county seat, about 40 minutes from here. She represented the Vasquez family a few years back in a zoning dispute that had Whitfield's fingerprints all over it, even though nobody could ever quite prove it. She won. Whitfield hasn't forgiven her since, which in my book makes her exactly the right choice." "Can you set up a meeting?" "I can do better than that," Briggs said. "I can tell you she already called my office yesterday afternoon, said she'd heard about the reopening and wondered if you might need someone in her line of work sooner rather than later." "Sounds like word travels fast in more directions than you might expect, Margaret. Not everyone in this county is on Whitfield's side of the ledger, whether he realizes it or not." Margaret felt something steady and certain settle into her chest. The same feeling she'd had standing in the storage room reading Ruth's second note, the same feeling she'd had watching the crowd stretch out the door on opening morning. She was not, she understood now with growing conviction, fighting this alone, and she had not been fighting it alone from the very first morning she'd unlocked that padlocked door and stepped into the dust and silence of a building that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this moment. "Set up the meeting," she said, "as soon as possible." She hung up the phone and looked around the bakery, at the flour still dusting the counters from the morning's work, at the recipe cards sitting in their small wooden box on the shelf where she'd moved them for easy reference, at the gold letters visible backward through the front window, catching the pale November light. Outside, somewhere across town, she knew Daniel Whitfield was already planning whatever came next. She was ready for it. Sarah Chen turned out to be exactly what Margaret needed: sharp, methodical, and entirely unafraid of Daniel Whitfield's reputation. Over the following months, she helped Margaret document every strange occurrence: the anonymous complaint, a sudden insurance premium increase that had no clear justification, a delayed permit renewal that mysteriously cleared the moment Sarah sent a formal inquiry letter. None of it alone would have proven anything. Together, laid out in careful order, it painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The bypass vote came before the town council in February. Margaret attended, sitting beside Frank and Patricia and Helen Kowalski in a packed meeting room, and watched Sarah Chen stand before the council and calmly present a timeline of Whitfield's property acquisitions along the proposed route, alongside the pattern of pressure applied to every tenant who had ever tried to hold that one corner he didn't already own. She never once accused him of anything illegal. She simply let the timeline speak for itself: dates and names and a picture that made 3 council members visibly shift in their seats. The vote was postponed for further review, and a formal ethics inquiry opened into Whitfield's role on the planning committee. He resigned from it 2 weeks later, quietly, without a public statement, though everyone in Millbrook understood exactly why. He never came back to the bakery. Margaret heard, secondhand through Patricia, that he'd sold off several of his downtown properties within the year, that his grip on the town had loosened just enough for other people to start breathing more easily. By spring, Coleman's had a waiting list for custom orders and 2 part-time employees besides Casey. Margaret started what she'd been dreaming about since that first Sunday meeting in Ruth's kitchen, though it was her own kitchen now, offering free baking classes on slow afternoons to anyone in town who wanted to learn. Women rebuilding lives the way she'd had to rebuild hers. Teenagers looking for their first real skill. An elderly widower named Otto, who came every Tuesday just for the company as much as the bread. She kept Ruth's recipe cards in their small wooden box on the shelf, exactly where she'd found them, and every new employee learned to bake from those same careful cursive instructions. Ruth's handwriting moving through the hands of people who had never known her name, the same way Evelyn Hartwell's knowledge had once moved through a valley Margaret would never visit in a story she would never read. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she'd first parked across the street and stared at the padlocked door, Margaret stood behind the marble counter as the morning light came gold through the front window, the smell of fresh bread filling the whole corner, and thought that she had come to Millbrook with $400 and nothing left to lose. She had built instead everything she still had: